Why would Vladimir Putin call Burkina Faso at 3 amperes m? A secure phone line lights up in Ouagadougou. Not rumor, not fiction. At that hour, while the world slept, the Kremlin dialed Captain Ibrahim Traore. And here's the shock. When empires tremble, they don't shout. They whisper to the leaders they fear most. For the West, it's instability. For the people, it's rebuilding schools by hand, farming with courage, and choosing sovereignty over subjugation. This was no ordinary call. It was a signal that Africa's awakening can no longer be ignored. According to Reuters, and confirmed by France 24, Ibrahim Traore has repeatedly declared that Burkina Faso will not bow to outside powers, neither Western nor Eastern. In a speech earlier this year, Traore stated clearly, "We refuse to be a playground for empires. Our people will decide their destiny." Even Russian state media, RIA Novosti, reported on Burkina Faso's shifting stance, acknowledging that Traore was charting a course of independence, even while global powers circled. But that is only the surface. A late-night call from Moscow hints at something far deeper, more unsettling, and more historic. The call began with silence. Ibrahim Traore stood alone in the dimly lit command room of Ouagadougou, the red receiver pressed against his ear. On the other end, Vladimir Putin's voice broke through, low and deliberate. "Captain Traore," he said, "you do not know how many in the West fear you more than they fear me." The words hung heavy. Outside, the streets were quiet, the city asleep, but within that silence lay the weight of centuries, colonial chains, foreign dictators, promises of aid that came with shackles. Traore listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on a map of Burkina Faso spread wide on the table before him. Putin continued, "Your refusal to bend, to take their loans, to sign their contracts, it has unsettled them. They thought Africa would forever be divided, distracted, dependent. But you, Ibrahim Traore, you have made Burkina Faso the heart of a storm." For a moment, Traore said nothing. He thought of the villages rebuilding schools from clay and wood, the mothers carrying water miles each day, the young soldiers standing at checkpoints with more courage than equipment. He thought of the sacrifices already made. Finally, he spoke. His tone was calm, almost detached. "Moscow has its interests. Washington has its interests. Paris has its interests. But Africa has its blood in the soil. Tell me, Mr. Putin, why should I trust your midnight call any more than their daylight promises?" The Kremlin leader paused, as though measuring each word. Then he admitted what no Western capital had ever dared, "Because Africa's awakening is not in my control." And that terrifies them. The line went quiet again. And in that silence, Ibrahim Traore understood this was not a courtesy call. It was an admission that the world had shifted, and Burkina Faso now stood at its center. As the call stretched past 3 in the morning, Traore walked slowly to the balcony overlooking Ouagadougou. The city lights flickered in patches, testimony to an energy grid still scarred by years of neglect. Yet beneath that darkness, he felt a pulse, the heartbeat of a people unwilling to surrender. Putin's voice pressed on, "Captain, I am not offering charity. I am warning you. They are plotting sanctions, destabilization, even removal. The West does not forgive defiance, and you, Ibrahim Traore, are defiance itself." Traore tightened his grip on the receiver. He recalled the threats already whispered through back channels: travel bans, frozen assets, subtle promises of exile, or worse. But what asset could be frozen that was worth more than the spirit of a nation? What exile could erase the memory of a people who chose dignity over dependency? "Then let them come," he replied firmly. "We have lived through worse than sanctions. Burkina Faso is not afraid of hunger, because we have already known famine. We are not afraid of isolation, because we have lived in solitude, but we will not live in chains." The Kremlin line went still. Then, unexpectedly, Putin's tone shifted, less calculated, almost reflective. "You remind me of a Russia They once tried to break, he said softly, but you carry something even stronger. You carry the raw fire of an Africa awakening. Traore exhaled, the weight of centuries echoing in his chest. The call was no longer about geopolitics. It was about truth. A truth that Moscow could admit in whispers, but Paris and Washington could never face aloud. That a young leader from Burkina Faso had become the embodiment of a continent's refusal to kneel. As the clock struck 4, Traore ended the call. The room returned to silence, but the echo of those words would spread far beyond the Kremlin or Ouagadougou. By dawn, the secret of the Kremlin call was already leaking, not through official channels, but through whispers carried by aides, guards, and sleepless clerks. In Ouagadougou's markets, where women laid out tomatoes and onions on worn mats, rumors spread faster than fire. They say, "Putin called our captain at 3 in the morning." One trader murmured. Another replied, "If that is true, then the world has finally turned its eyes to Burkina Faso." The story ignited imaginations. Some saw it as a sign of strength that Ibrahim Traore had forced even Russia to acknowledge Africa's rising power. Others feared it meant new dangers, sanctions, assassinations, a storm too large for one small nation to bear. Meanwhile, inside the presidential compound, Traore gathered his closest advisors. The red phone still sat on the table, as though it carried the weight of destiny. They will ask what was said, one advisor warned. They will demand explanations. Traore shook his head. Let them wonder. Sometimes, power is not in what you reveal, but in what you leave unsaid. His words cut through the room. Every man and woman present understood that the midnight call was no longer just a conversation, it was a weapon. If the world believed Putin feared Traore, then the myth itself was a shield, a declaration that Burkina Faso could no longer be ignored. That morning, state radio hinted cryptically at a communication of historic importance. By noon, Africa news outlets were buzzing. Headlines asked whether Burkina Faso was forging a secret alliance with Moscow. Western commentators rushed to television studios, speculating about hidden deals, military aid, or energy contracts. None knew the truth, but all feared the possibility that Africa's youngest leader had tilted the balance of power overnight. By the afternoon, the question had leapt beyond Ouagadougou. In Dakar, Bamako, and Accra, professors debated on radio shows. Was Ibrahim Traore quietly negotiating a new African doctrine, or was the Kremlin merely exploiting a restless continent? In Paris and Washington, think tanks issued hurried memos with titles like "The Burkina Faso Question." But inside Traore's own heart, the matter was not about strategy. It was about survival. As he walked the halls of the modest palace, he thought not of Moscow or Washington, but of the villages where barefoot children sat on cracked floors to learn their first letters. He thought of the farmers sowing seed by hand, hoping the rains would not betray them. These were the people whose dignity he defended, whose sovereignty could not be bartered in midnight deals. At a closed-door meeting with commanders that evening, Traore spoke plainly. "We will not exchange one master for another. Burkina Faso will walk its own road. If Putin calls again, I will listen, but I will not kneel." His generals, many veterans of battles against insurgents, nodded in silence. They knew the risks. Every foreign handshake carried hidden chains, yet they also felt the rare strength of a leader who refused both flattery and intimidation. That night, foreign embassies buzzed with urgency. Some diplomats pressed for immediate sanctions, others for covert operations. But a truth unsettled them. Ibrahim Traore was no longer just a man. He was a story. And stories, once lit, can outlast armies. On the streets of Ouagadougou, murals began to appear, rough paintings of Traore, standing tall beneath an African sun, with the caption, "We choose freedom at any cost." The call from the Kremlin had become folklore, a symbol that even the mighty were listening. The days that followed the Kremlin call were restless. Western media filled the air with speculation. The New York Times ran a headline, Putin courts Burkina Faso's Traoré and midnight gamble. In London, a former diplomat claimed, if Moscow gains Ouagadougou, Africa will never be the same. But in Burkina Faso itself, the people didn't speak in terms of geopolitics. They spoke in terms of pride. In the cafes, old men recalled the days of Thomas Sankara, when the nation first dared to stand against empires. Now, they whispered, Traoré was carrying the torch. In a private gathering, Traoré addressed a group of young officers. His voice was firm, but not fiery. Do not mistake this for flattery. The world is not celebrating us. It is calculating us. But the measure of a nation is not what others think we are worth. It is what we refuse to sell. The officers listened closely. Many of them were barely older than students, but they understood the burden of being hunted by forces much larger than themselves. The Kremlin call was not a gift, it was a warning. That same evening, a storm broke over Ouagadougou. Rain hammered the tin roofs, lightning split the sky. From his office window, Traoré watched the storm with quiet resolve. They will come with offers, he thought. They will come with threats. But if we endure this storm, Africa will know that freedom is possible across Africa. The news cycle spun endlessly. Commentators asked, could Burkina Faso become the epicenter of a new era? Could Ibrahim Traoré's defiance inspire a generation, or would he be crushed before his dream could grow roots? For Traoré, the question was not abstract. It was survival. Every move he made now would either shield his people or expose them. Weeks after the midnight call, a curious shift began to unfold. Reports leaked of Western envoys offering new partnerships. Aid packages appeared suddenly generous. Promises of military cooperation multiplied, and ambassadors filled their speeches with the word friendship. But Traoré recognized the pattern. He told his advisors bluntly, they do not come to help us. They come to buy us, and what they cannot buy, they will try to break. One evening, sitting with his inner circle, he shared Putin's most haunting line, "Destiny makes enemies." The words echoed in the room like thunder. His ministers exchanged uneasy glances. Some feared what lay ahead. Others felt emboldened. Across the Sahel, whispers grew louder. From Bamako to Niamey, people asked, was Africa truly on the verge of something unstoppable? The mere fact that Moscow had called Ouagadougou at 3 a.m., not Paris, not Washington. But Burkina Faso was enough to ignite imaginations. Then came the rumors of plots. Anonymous leaflets appeared in Ouagadougou markets, warning of traitors within. A pro-Western journalist published an article claiming Traoré had secretly promised gold concessions to Russia. It was false, but the damage was real. Doubt is a sharper weapon than any blade. Traoré countered not with denials, but with clarity. At a rally in the capital, before tens of thousands, he declared, Burkina Faso is not for sale, neither to the west nor to the east. If the world fears us, let it be because we choose to be free. The crowd erupted, their chants drowning out the echoes of foreign disinformation. For the first time, the narrative was not written in Washington or Moscow. It was being carved, word by word, in Ouagadougou. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room inside the Kremlin, aides briefed Putin on the African response. Some urged caution, warning that Traoré was unpredictable, but Putin leaned back, eyes narrowing. Unpredictable, he said quietly, is what makes him dangerous to them and valuable to us. Thus, the legend of the 3 a.m. call deepened. It was no longer just a private exchange. It became the axis around which Africa's future turned. Just when the dust seemed to settle, a revelation detonated across Africa's media landscape. A leaked transcript surfaced allegedly from within Moscow, detailing fragments of that 3 a.m. conversation. It wasn't the threat or warning that stunned observers, it was the confession. Putin had admitted, in words few could imagine, that Russia had once exploited Africa no less than the West. He acknowledged broken promises, hollow alliances, and greed disguised as partnership. For the first time, Africans saw something extraordinary, a superpower confessing its sins. Commentators across Africa News and Jeune Afrique debated furiously. Was it genuine, or was it psychological warfare? Either way, the effect was seismic. In Burkina Faso, Traoré seized the moment. At a press gathering, he didn't confirm or deny the leak. Instead, he looked directly into the cameras and said, "Whether the words are true or not, the lesson is real. No empire comes to Africa without interest. Our future depends not on their honesty, but on our strength." That single line ricocheted across the continent. In Lagos, radio hosts replayed it on loop. In Dakar, university students painted it on banners. Suddenly, the midnight call was no longer about Putin, it was about Africa's awakening. For Traoré, this was the twist. The Kremlin's vulnerability had armed him with something more powerful than weapons. A narrative of sovereignty. The leak did not remain in African circles alone. In Washington, the State Department scrambled to assess its authenticity. In Paris, old colonial bureaucrats whispered in panic. If Russia itself admitted exploitation, what would that mean for France's own crumbling reputation in West Africa? But the real shock came from within Africa's younger generation. Instead of fear, they felt clarity. The confession, whether true or forged, stripped away the illusion that any global power was free of self-interest. Social media exploded with a new slogan: "No savior but ourselves." Memes, podcasts, TikTok clips all carried the same message. Suddenly, African sovereignty was not a dream held by politicians. It was a chorus sung by millions of ordinary citizens. Traoré leaned into this wave, without raising his voice, without parading soldiers. He announced Burkina Faso's plan for a Pan-African technology fund, built from regional mining revenues. Not foreign loans. "They give us loans at 10%, he said quietly. "But we can lend to ourselves at 2%. The simplicity was devastating. Analysts in London's financial district admitted, off the record, that if this fund succeeded, Africa could shield itself from IMF dependency within a decade. The twist was complete. What began as a clandestine midnight call between two men had mutated into a continental revelation. The world now saw Africa not as the pawn in a duel between Moscow and Washington, but as a player rewriting the rules of the game. In a surprising countermove, the Kremlin denied everything. Their spokesman dismissed the leaked call as a fabrication of Western intelligence, but in Africa, no one was listening to denials anymore. The damage, or perhaps the liberation, had already been done. In Ouagadougou, students marched with placards that read, "Neither Washington nor Moscow, only Africa." In Dakar, musicians sampled the leaked audio into beats that filled nightclubs. What was once whispered, resistance became a public anthem. The West expected chaos. Instead, they witnessed discipline. Traoré called an emergency summit with Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Cameras captured him, entering the hall, not with tanks or threats, but with a single notebook in hand. On the first page were 4 words, "We write the terms." That phrase ricocheted across the continent. For decades, Africa had been the subject of agreements drafted elsewhere: Paris, London, Washington, Beijing. Now, for the first time, a coalition spoke of writing contracts on African soil in African languages, with African priorities. Financial markets trembled. Energy traders in New York warned of unpredictable supply chains. European diplomats urged restraint, but privately admitted they had lost narrative control. And yet, the strangest twist came not from Africa or the West, but from ordinary Russians themselves. Online forums lit up with comments like, "If Africans can reject both powers, why can't we?" The sovereignty fever had jumped borders. What began as an African awakening was now haunting the very empires that had tried to dominate it. History is rarely rewritten in silence, but sometimes it begins with a whisper, a call in the night, a phrase on a page, a truth too dangerous to be ignored. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Conakry, Africa has heard that whisper, and answered with a roar. Ibrahim Traore did not promise paradise. He promised something far harder: sovereignty. He asked his people not to wait for saviors, but to build with their own hands. And in that choice, Africa revealed its greatest power, the courage to define its destiny, not through others' permission, but through its own conviction. The West is bewildered, the East is unsettled. Both are watching a continent they once underestimated awaken with a clarity sharper than steel. For the first time in centuries, Africa is not merely reacting to history, it is writing it. And this story is larger than one man or one nation. It is a reminder that every empire eventually learns truth cannot be contained, and sovereignty cannot be negotiated away. What was once dismissed as impossible is now unfolding in plain sight. Imagine the headlines a decade from now. African bank rivals IMF. Pan-African Technology Fund launches satellite network. Burkina Faso farmers power the continent's food security. These are not fantasies. They are blueprints waiting for the will to carry them forward. The midnight call, the leak, the denial, all of it matters less than the awakening it ignited. For whether Moscow admits its ambitions or Washington masks its fear, one fact now shines, undeniable. Africa has found its voice, and the world must listen. So, I ask you not as spectators, but as witnesses of history, do you believe this generation will complete the work of liberation, not just from colonial chains, but from dependency itself? Or will the old empires reclaim their grip? The answer will not be decided in Paris, Washington, or Moscow. It will be decided in Ouagadougou, in Dakar, in Lagos, in every African street where young men and women dare to say, "We write the terms,